All right, joining me today on Detroit Next is former police chief James Craig. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
Glad to be here.
I'm excited to talk with you. I feel like public safety has been, a really central issue in this race. Obviously, it's been a long-running issue in the city, and you have the most experience. I think comfortable saying in dealing with that. Let's just start, kind of high level. What's your vision for public safety in the city?
Well, as you know, you indicated 44 years in public service. I started my policing career right here in the city of Detroit when Coleman Young was mayor, and was 19 years old, served 2.5 years, and got laid off.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I got laid off, I had to make a decision. Go to the West Coast or go to Toledo, Ohio. Very difficult decision, but of course, ended up going to LA, where I served in that department for almost 3 decades, rose through the ranks. But even when I was in Detroit, I had set a goal early in my career to become a chief of police. Primarily, it was to become a Detroit police chief, but I didn't know I was going to make the sharp right turn and go to the West Coast, and I did. So I rose through the ranks. I had a great career in Los Angeles and was a finalist in a couple of departments, Boston, Massachusetts, Tucson, Arizona, for Palm Springs, and then Portland came through first and made a job offer, Portland, Maine.
Mm-hmm.
So I served there for 2 years, very interesting city, certainly gained a lot of experience in that city. And then from there, became a major city chief is what it's called. I was a chief in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there 2.5 years. And then Michigan called because, as you know, in 2013, the city was facing bankruptcy. It did go through bankruptcy. An emergency manager was brought in, and the state was interested to know if I would be interested in coming in during that very challenging time. And of course, I've always loved the challenge, but more importantly, I got to come home. So I made a decision to do that. But I want to digress for a minute because what was interesting, because the question I oftentimes get asked, well, when did you decide to transition from policing to politics? And, and having been a police chief in 3 cities, certainly there's a political element to that.
You were the first Black chief in Cincinnati as well as Portland, Maine,
First,
right?
in both cities, the first African-American chief in Portland. Well, actually in Maine, in the entire state.
Oh, wow.
Then Cincinnati, which is probably almost half Black, I was the first. I think I was the 13th police chief there and the first outsider. So I didn't know what to expect going there, but what a great time. But I will tell you, one of my first meetings I had with top CEOs in the city, and for those who know Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble is headquartered there,
Mm-hmm.
American Financial, Kroger, they wanted to meet with me. And what they wanted to know is, what are you going to do to create a safe city? But more importantly, we want to really move forward and develop an area called Over the Rhine. It was a historic area in Cincinnati, but it was one of the most violent parts of the city. And so I sat there for a moment, thought about it. I said, well, I can do it. We can make it safe, and you can do development, but you're going to have to help me. And they kind of looked puzzled. I said, well, I don't want to use tax dollars to pay officers overtime. So that said, I'm going to need your financial help. You pay for the officers overtime, we can do it. And certainly the department got it done. I put them on foot beats around the clock. That area became safe. They ended up developing. The irony of it, catacorner to that area was a casino being built by Dan Gilbert. And very successful outcome, but certainly have no regrets making a decision to come to Detroit. But that same group of businessmen approached me and said, Chief, you don't need to go back home to Detroit. It's going through bankruptcy. It's a mess. Stay here in Cincinnati, and we want to run you for mayor of Cincinnati. And so I was humbled by that. And I said, well, now I get to go home. And it was an easy decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so ended up serving 8 years as chief, one of the longest running chiefs, only exceeded by William Hart.
Mm-hmm.
I think he might have done 14 years. But certainly going through that moment, with the city going through bankruptcy and the challenges. Now, while there was a lot to be done in the city, there was a lot to be done in the police department. We heard the stories, 1 hour response time to 911 calls, homicide clearance rate that was at 11%, one of the lowest in the country. Certainly the morale of the men and women who served in the department was at the very bottom. Their salaries were taken. They were forced into 12-hour shifts. And then the morale of the community was at the bottom because they didn't trust the police department.
Mhm.
So this was a heavy lift, but we got through it. Certainly, as we talk more today, I'll go into a little more detail. But it's a natural progression for me. As you know, when I retired and left office after 8 years, I was pulled vigorously to consider a run for governor. I did do that. I have no regrets. In fact, throughout that campaign, I was a leading candidate on a GOP ticket,
Mhm.
double-digit lead. And certainly the fraudsters got in and got some bad signatures. So several of us got taken off the ballot.
Right.
And so I had to kind of wait and see what next steps would be. And here I am today. A lot of people asked me while I was a chief, said, why don't you run for mayor? And I said, well, I don't run against my boss. I thought that Mayor Doug and I had a great relationship, did great work together. And he was my boss. So no, I wasn't going to run against him.
Mhm.
He was a 3-term mayor, but once he decided I'm not going to run, I'm going to run for governor, then it was an easy decision.
Tell me about what you would do to advance the work that you started as police chief, when it relates to public safety. If you were to become mayor, how do you want to continue to build on, some of that progress we've seen?
Well, as I look back at our successes and the things we put in place, some may or may not know that, the police department didn't manage through, it was like they did crime control meetings where, having worked in Los Angeles and certainly under one of my mentors, Bill Bratton, who really was the innovator of CompStat. I'm talking about a management, data-driven management program that was very successful. But what was key to the program, not just managing the data relative to crime, but holding command and executive level staff members accountable.
Mhm.
That's the real key to this. And so I brought CompStat to Detroit because there were things that needed to be addressed, not just reducing crime, but management and executive level accountability. One of the things I did coming in the door was make assessments. And during those assessments, I built a new management team. Your viewers may recall that Detroit Police Department was under federal oversight for 13 years.
Mhm.
One of the longest running consent decrees, and we got out from under it within 1 year of my administration. Not by accident, certainly leadership played a key role, but accountability played a bigger role. And when that happened, we were able to move forward from that. So the morale was raised. Certainly a new management team came in. We got response times down to a national average of about 7 minutes. Certainly our homicide clearance rates increased. We leveraged a lot of technology. We built a real-time crime center.
Mhm.
And I want to go into it, maybe not right now, but about Greenlight Detroit, certainly one of the success stories on my watch. But that said, as mayor, I would build on that. I already have a plan on what we can do to really take the great work that Mayor Duggan did and move it to the next level. And this is not unique to Detroit. So many cities have these heavy red tape bureaucracies,
Mhm.
municipalities or just governmental entities. When it comes to service delivery, they're not always the best. I strive on, service excellence, and that's part of the whole CompStat. So one of the things that I will implement is a city stat. Now, city stat is a derivative of CompStat, but on a much larger level because you're managing an entire city network as opposed to the police department looking at finite things.
Is
But
this like a data dashboard or
it's a
break it down
data,
for me a little
it
bit?
will have a data dashboard. And certainly I'm not going to build the whole plan out because I know my colleagues that are running with me would love to take it and run with it. But it's not an easy process to understand. And it really does require leadership. I was trained in it. I managed it as a commanding officer in Los Angeles and actually took that model to 3 different cities. And everywhere we took it, it worked. And so my plan is to launch CityStat here in Detroit. But we're going to look at issues like how do we grow our middle class?
Mhm.
How do we, create or reduce the wealth gap in our city? Those kind of things are measurable. I mean, how do we increase home ownership? How about small businesses? And when we look at one of the challenges in our city, as I see it, is there's so much red tape. And I've talked to several small business owners, and they constantly complain about it just takes me so long to jump through the hoops that you have to jump through to start a business in Detroit. Like, it was an article written probably 2 or 3 years ago, 77 steps, more than most large cities, to open a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not acceptable. One of the things that I launched when I was a police chief, and uh, the community loved it, was neighborhood police officers. So I deployed an officer in very defined geographic areas in the city to do one thing, to connect with that community. And so we put them in cars, we gave them electronics, phones, and pads, and the community knew if there was a quality of life issue that needed addressed, they don't have to call headquarters and be met with a recording device, or they turn in a complaint and it takes days, in some instances weeks. This is real time. And so in real time, the officers in that area working, and a community member who has that neighborhood police officer's number makes a phone call. Hey, we got loitering and dice playing at a liquor store on the corner of Dexter and Doors. We need help. And so, and what I found fascinating, because I worked a similar program as an officer in LA, very few complaints actually come into the chief's office, because people know I don't need to complain. I have an officer who I used to call as the mini chiefs.
Mm-hmm.
And these mini chiefs would make decisions out in the field. And certainly if they needed other resources to help address whatever the complaint is, we bring them in, not a problem, but largely successful. And so in the mayor model of city stat will be somewhat similar. You know, the mayor launched district managers. I think that's a phenomenal way to go. But what I would take with district managers is really take it to the next level. Give them more authority to make decisions, but alongside those district managers will be neighborhood liaisons.
Mm-hmm.
Those individuals will be in their defined districts, just like my neighborhood police officers. They'll be out there to respond to that small business owner, or that entrepreneur who's looking to move forward, or that homeowner who is wanting to buy a land bank home, but is going through so many challenges to go through that hoop. So I see it as a way of streamlining services. When it's time for inspections, instead of going through a centralized entity in the city, like BC's what it's called now,
Mm-hmm.
These individuals would be on the ground, and some of them will already be trained to do the inspections. But it would just cut so much of the red tape out and the time entrepreneurs wait. And it would also help large corporations. I want to support them too. They go through a similar process. But if we have people assigned to work that area, and then certainly if bigger issues come up, then that's when you bring in other resources from City Hall to help expedite that process.
You've talked about wanting to blow up BC.
I call it blow up. Restructure is
Yeah.
a better word, because when, of course it is blowing it up figuratively, but restructuring it. And I see the future BC more as an inspection audit entity that supports those staff in the field who are doing the real work. And so I'm excited, and certainly in my office as mayor, I would have a city stat unit that does nothing but get the data. And the reason why it's important to put that office in the mayor's office, because the mayor sets the tone.
Mm-hmm.
And if I believe in it, and the staff of the city know that I'm paying attention, this is important, then it's going to be a different kind of response. Now, I'll tell you, because I saw it in every police department, the one who fears the ComStat, or in this case, the city stat, are the folks at the top of their departments, the department heads.
Mm.
I want to support them, but clearly, if they're not performing and providing our taxpayers what they deserve, then it's time for a change.
You've talked about wanting to bring accountability back to, I mean, various aspects. You talk about it in terms of the schools, which I want to talk about.
Oh, absolutely.
But, going back to your time as police chief, it seemed like that was one of the things that you wanted to do in bringing in new administrators and kind of creating some more accountability there. What do you think is really lacking in terms of,
Well,
accountability for our city
I'm
officials?
happy. Well, you want me to talk about schools now, or you want me to just in terms of
We can talk about
overall
schools. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm passionate about it. Certainly, I started work as a police captain, working with a middle school because I saw some of the problems. And without going into a long, drawn out description of what that looked like, we put a boot camp in a middle school. Certainly, that school was located in a high crime gang area of Los Angeles. Um, Clearly, the young people were experiencing behavioral issues. And so I went to the administrator. I said, look, I have an idea. Trust me to come in here as an after school program. Give me your most challenging students, and we can turn them. 10-week program. And so we did it, and we turned them. We ran another class, 10 weeks. We brought the parents in, and phenomenal success.
Mm-hmm. You talked about wanting to replicate this in the city, right?
Well, we did do it.
Okay.
I did it in Cincinnati because we saw some of the same issues in some of the more vulnerable neighborhoods of color. Certainly the public schools have some challenges, and I know how important it is to partner with the schools to get the work done. We did in Cincinnati, although they didn't like it being called boot camp. Said, Chief, that's too harsh. I said, what's harsh is the pipeline to prison. I said, we can talk about the name, but if this saves a young person, that they graduate and go on and have a productive career in some way, what's more important? So, we met in the middle, and I renamed it City Camp, Children in Trauma Intervention, because truly a lot of these young people were in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of PTSD, you think only police officers or someone who served in the military, but really think about a young person growing up in a vulnerable neighborhood that's violent. At times, parents may have been shot in a violent encounter, friends, relatives. What impact does that have on that child? Very
Mm-hmm.
direct impact. So we launched it in Cincinnati, successful. Did a couple of classes there. Resistance by the school at first. The schools were like, well, if this doesn't work out, well, I'm not taking responsibility for it.
Mm-hmm.
Chief, this is yours. And I have no problem with that. And so when we came to Detroit, launched a similar program. And in fact, we ended up putting City Camp in an entire middle school here on the east side of Detroit. The outcome was good, but that's the partnership. That's the collaboration. And so as mayor, I recognize that, the mayor doesn't run the school, but public education is important. And if we don't fix that, we can talk all we want about bringing in new businesses, creating a city, the best city in the country. But if we have broken schools, let's take a step back and let's be realistic about this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why some young parents with children say, well, and I've heard them say it, I moved out of Detroit because one young entrepreneur told me I moved out of Detroit because I wanted my son to get a better education. And I just wasn't confident that I could get it here in Detroit. And these are the kind of real conversations we need to have. And those who are in political positions and political leadership positions
Message on your phone.
cannot ignore it. It affects the city.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean we have to be in conflict with one another. I've been very public about it. In fact, when I was running for governor, I was alarmed at what I was starting to find out, especially in communities of color. I'm talking around the state, Detroit, Flint, Benton Harbor, common theme. Middle school children or third graders cannot read.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in Detroit, by way of example, and I'm told that stat has changed since it's been 3 years since I ran for governor. And I always ask this question, what do you think the percentage could be? And they say, well, 25, 35, 40%, still a failing grade. 8%.
Yeah. I think it's like 11 now, so it hasn't
That's
gone up by
11.
very
It
much.
still hasn't, that's still failing.
Yeah.
And so the reason why they set the standard that by the time a child is in the third grade, they must be able to read, then guess what? if they go to the 4th grade and they can't read, what happens after that? And then with this mindset, well, let's just push them through because we don't want them to be demoralized because they haven't gone from 3rd, 4th, and 5th. What's most important, let's educate these young people because it will impact them later. And unfortunately, some young people opt to drop out because they're not learning over time. And we all know that there's a greater likelihood when a young person drops out of school, that's the pipeline to incarceration.
Yeah.
More likely and then I saw this firsthand. So when Mayor Duggan, phenomenal job at really negotiating with Stellantis to bring an assembly plant here, the Jeep plant, which was a big deal because Detroit hadn't seen the development of a new auto plant in excess of 30 years.
Yeah, there were thousands of jobs that were promised as part of that.
3,500 Detroiters, part of his negotiation was 3,500 Detroiters would get hired. But here's what we learned. Some of those Detroiters who grew up in Detroit public schools, the plants of today, you have to take an examination. Basic exam. When I worked on an assembly line right out of high school, there was no exam. You just walk in, get a job. That's not how it is today. So what impact, because of a failed education system, does that have on our future workforce?
Yeah, we know we don't have that talent pipeline happening the way it should be because of that. Yeah.
I mean, I dealt with it in the police department. People say, hire Detroiters. Well, you know, I was a Detroiter when I got hired, and I believe in Detroiters becoming police officers. The neighborhood I grew up in, the 10th precinct on the west side of Detroit, was the same neighborhood I ended up patrolling as a police officer a few years later. So I understand the importance of someone growing up in the city. And that's not to take anything away from those who live outside the city, because I've worked with some phenomenal police officers who come from all over.
Yeah. But I've heard you say before, probably to jump ahead of your point, that it was difficult for some Detroiters to pass through the application process to become a police officer because they lacked the literacy skills or other kinds of skills they should have learned in the schools.
And that's the disappointing part. And so I know in LA, we saw the similar thing in LA, and we were starting to talk about doing this here in Detroit, where what we did for those applicants that came from those vulnerable neighborhoods in LA who wanted to be police officers, we would set up like a 3-month remediation phase to prep them for being able to pass the exam. But it's not just getting in the door. Once you get in the door and you get into the police academy, then there's the academic portion. And one of the biggest challenges for a lot of these new officers in the academy is getting through law. Now, we're not talking about law school. We're just talking about basic law. But again, it requires reading. And if you can't read, there's going to be a challenge. So when folks want to skirt the issue of public education, opt not to talk about it, I think everybody viewing this should say he's right and we need to do better.
Education and the mayor's role in education is definitely a big issue in this race that candidates are talking about. Obviously, the mayor has limited authority in, dictating what can happen in schools.
Right.
But in some of our past conversations, you've talked about how, the low percentage of students who can read at a 3rd grade level is a pretty damning reflection of the leadership in the public school system, and that
it's a reflection on the superintendent. I always oftentimes make this comparison. As chief of police, if I was performing at an F level, if we want to argue and say, well, if only 8% can read in the 3rd grade, that's a big fat F. If I'm performing at an F as a police chief, how long would I last? I'll tell you how long. It probably would have been but a couple of months. I'd been gone. Look, it's no secret. Detroit has seen its share of police chiefs through the revolving door for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just because there's a new administration incoming. But there should be accountability because it's that important. And this is not a reflection on the teachers. I think the teachers need to be supported. And certainly I want to play a role in being a great partner. And that does translate in supporting those principals and those teachers. Because the other thing I know from leadership, and by the way, I'm writing a book on leadership. I'm done with it all. I got a few more
Is
chapters.
that coming out this year or
It's coming out this year. I'm so
Okay.
excited. The
Interesting.
publisher assured me that it'll be out because actually it's fully written now. It's 15 chapters. It really talks about the journey, talks about leadership.
You got a title?
I'm mulling over that right now. The title that the publisher and I came up is bland. I need something that's going to grab
A little
someone.
sizzle.
A little sizzle.
Okay.
Because it's a great story, and I'm really excited, and I'm hoping that it really touches some folks because the journey is exciting. The challenges I face coming up, in this business, up until the point where I've now become, and I don't want to use the word politician because I am a public servant.
Mm-hmm. To hang on schools for a second, we have had conversations with candidates who want to create more wraparound services for schools, similar to, I think, kind of the boot camp style things that you're talking about, have more after school programs, find a way to provide some resources outside of the classroom for kids. I'm wondering what can be done to create that accountability that you're talking about. What more beyond offering, opening up rec centers for different after school activities and things like that, can we actually do to improve the outcomes, to hold the leaders of these schools accountable the way that you've been talking about?
Well, having been in leadership, I'm the candidate that has true executive level experience. I understand what transparency, which is very important, but accountability really looks like. It's one thing to talk about these lofty programs, but if there's no accountability, because let's face it, the mayor does not control the school board.
Mm-hmm.
The mayor does not control the superintendent. The mayor can work in partnership. The mayor can certainly leverage funds from the federal, state government to help support the schools, because that's critical. But when you get the money to support the schools, what are the schools doing with the money? There has to be transparency and there has to be accountability. So we can talk about rec centers and all those things are good. After school programs, all that's good. What has been done up to this point, especially for those who've been in political positions, what has really been done?
Mm-hmm.
Because the needle hasn't moved that much.
What can be done though? Because you have those limitations of authority. So how do you create accountability when you're not really able to say?
Well, you use your bully pulpit. The mayor has a big voice, and certainly if the mayor is credible, certainly I know even as a police chief and later as a gubernatorial candidate and now a mayoral candidate, this resonates with people. Detroiters deserve to have access to good education, just like folks in Birmingham or Troy.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we want Detroiters to move out to ensure a good education? And then you talk about people who live in vulnerable communities who don't have the access to transportation or the money to move their children into a private or charter school. Neighborhood schools matter. Growing up here in Detroit, I know how important it was to my parents. I went to neighborhood schools, and of course, as we talked, I made a choice, Central High or Cass Tech. I went to Cass Tech because I knew as a young man, I wanted the best education. And so Detroiters deserve that, and they need to have that. So I'm not going to sit here and say, well, but more important than that, what have I done personally? And that's why I brought up the whole thing with, starting a boot camp, certainly later called City Camp, that was very effective. And then the report coming back from the school administration said, these were children that were failing. And after this basic 10 weeks, the grades changed.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I hear so many excuses and they say, well, and I heard this from a brilliant educator as recent as today at our barbershop, because we had a lengthy conversation about this.
We do share a barber.
We share a barber. And so
coincidentally.
Right. But what was interesting in the conversation, and I've heard this excuse, well, children don't go to school. Children don't go to school. And parents are not involved. Here's what I find interesting about that statement. Drawing back on my experience in working with challenged students, you know what the most important part of that work, when the children knew, I'm talking about police officers, They knew we were there, and it was difficult for some of them because we had to change behaviors. We're talking about a boot camp.
Hmm.
I remember when a young person would not show up for the Saturday session, which was a half-day session, I would send police officers at home and pick them up.
How did they react to that?
They didn't like it, but eventually it was a shift. So the key is not excuse making. It's really taking a serious look and saying, wait a minute, the problem lies in how the teachers are treated. Now I'm getting ready to go somewhere, and this is where leadership plays a big role. If teachers feel supported, guess what? They're going to perform differently. Let's talk about the police officers. I talked briefly about how I raised morale. Police officers didn't feel supported, forced into 12-hour shifts. A percentage of their pay, I think it was 10% of their pay taken. They didn't feel supported and forced into these 12-hour shifts, and most of them ended up working 16-hour shifts. And I'll never forget the look on an officer on the east side of Detroit, because I had started the conversation about getting rid of the 12-hour shifts. And I went to an accident scene, and he looked at me and said, "Chief, we need your help, please." That quick, changed it. The teachers need to be supported. If the teachers are supported, that's going to translate into how the children feel. It's really about leadership.
Mhm.
And I don't care who you are, whether you're a superintendent, a governor, a mayor, a police chief, you set the tone for the agency. As the next mayor, I will set the tone for the city.
What do you make of the community violence intervention program that Detroit has been running using federal pandemic relief? I think it's interesting you talk about the boot camp. There were some initial maybe hesitation to being involved in a program that had, it was a police, kind of fronted organization. This is very different. These are community groups that,
Right.
your successor, former Chief White, talked about how there's certain things that police can do, and there are things that the police can't do, and we need to partner with people in these
Right.
communities that have relationships with folks in a way that police don't. So, do you feel like that has been able to address the problem in a different way? And just,
Well,
would you continue that if
I
mayor?
would tell you, and certainly I'm going to look at every aspect of the operation, uh, not just the police department. Those who are working in that capacity, I know many of them. I worked very closely with them as chief. They were very helpful for me. Uh, Initially, there was no good relationship because, frankly, because of the lack of trust that the community had with the Detroit Police Department, a lot of these organizations were birthed. And this was before I got there, like Detroit 300 and certainly New Era Detroit. They felt that somebody's got to step in and do what the police haven't done.
Mhm.
And I know this is talk that some might agonize over. I love this police department. Certainly on my watch, I felt we became one of the top police departments in the country. But that said, let's talk about the way it was and why so many groups came about. Uh, I don't know the success rate because I'm not there now. Conceptually, it sounds like something that could and does work. In fact, when I was in LA and I was a commanding officer, we had a similar effort, and this was back in the 90s. It started where we were working with ex-gang members in the neighborhoods where gang violence was prevalent.
Mhm.
And because of those relationships, the violence started to shift away from the areas. And so I believe that there is a lot of good that can come from that. But I can't make an assessment on it without knowing, when you talk about, and I know recently, I don't know if it was Chief White or Bettison, but I guess Detroit experienced a um, homicide rate that mirrored what it was in like 65 or
Yeah,
66.
it's the lowest
The
number of
lowest, but see,
homicides. Yeah.
here's when we talk about transparency, and again, I'm not being critical of either one of those individuals because they worked for me. Certainly, I had an influence on them in different ways. But here's what the community wants to know. That's fine, but the perception of crime is still high.
Right.
And you have to address the perception. When Detroiters would approach me and say, Chief, we miss you. We wish you would come back. And I'm always humbled when I hear that. But it's that perception of crime. So we should never, lose sight of that. But here's the other, because I'm a data guy. So what was Detroit like in 66 or 65? Fifth largest city.
Yeah, had about 1 million more people for one.
1,000,005 or 1,000,006.
Mm-hmm.
Police department was 6,500. So when you talk about the same homicide rate, it's hard to declare a win without talking about these other issues.
Yeah.
And so being transparent, yes, I'd sit up and applaud, and I've applauded. And I want to talk a little bit about this because I know our time is short, about Greenlight Detroit.
Yeah.
But when we talk about that, we got to also talk about what the city looked like in 1965 and the number of police officers we had deployed at that time, the fifth largest city, And so we fast forward to a city, like you say, we're at 633,000. I think we're ranked number 17 in the country right now.
I think we're 26. We just got some new census data. So.
Well, we popped up a bit. I think we gained from the year prior, I think we gained 7,000.
Yep.
And so that's good news, and we should continue to move up. However, when we have a discussion, let's not be quick to wave the flag of success, but let's balance it with saying, wow, this is good news, but great news is when I can go to Miss Smith, who lives in the 9th precinct, and she says, Chief, I really feel safer. And I wish I could go into how, because the one thing we were always equitable about making sure, public safety was across the board, whether it was the more affluent areas or the areas that are most challenged. We made sure that we had enough police officers deployed in those neighborhoods. But I want to talk about this. So we talk about crime reductions. So here's what's interesting. When I came in July of 2013, by the end of 2013, there were 800 carjackings, 800 in the city of Detroit. Detroit was coined the carjack capital of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not surprised. When you talk about numbers like that in a city our size, with a population our size, let's have a conversation about that. But here's what was odd for me. Now, while I was born here, I left here. So coming back, the thing that was most noticeable on that issue, police officers desensitized on carjackings. You would think we were talking about someone breaking into a locked car. The citizens were desensitized. It was almost an acceptance. Well, this is kind of the way it is. And so I wanted to know, using data, where these carjackings were occurring. And predictably, they were happening generally during hours of darkness, but at places what I call, for robbers, places of opportunity, high traffic places like gas station, liquor store, party store. So I started reflecting on it, and my folks always knew I always had dreams. I had a dream about this whole concept of green light. It started out very small. And so, and using a broken windows concept, I said, how about we partner with those gas stations or liquor stores that are clean? Management certainly cares about its customers. They take pride in the way the location looks. And that sounds like a simple thing, but it's a big thing. So we partnered initially with like 8 locations, and we wanted to market it so that the community knew that, hey, this green light, this is a safe place. This is a place where, management want to work with the patrons. And that was the early iteration of Greenlight. And so about this time, I think Mike Duggan was already in office, and we started talking about real-time crime center, which we had. And the mayor was great about supporting a lot of the initiatives I had in terms of bringing technology into police department. and we start talking about a public-private partnership, especially with these gas stations and liquor stores where carjackings and other crimes were occurring, what if we leveraged Comcast to come in, work with the businesses, of course, not at taxpayer dollars, but that the business would say, look, we'll get Wi-Fi, we'll purchase the cameras and purchase service through Comcast, which they did.
Mm-hmm.
They purchased the service, and we then said, we'll connect this live feed into police headquarters, our real-time crime center.
Yeah. And that's led to a reduction in carjackings.
Well, let me just say this, and I apologize for going a long way around, but for your viewers, I want them to understand.
Yeah, context is important.
It's very important. But remember that number 800 plus?
Mm-hmm.
My last full year, just at 200. Now, you want to talk about success. I mean, perception of crime, people would go. It was so popular that people in neighborhoods would come to me and say, we're going to boycott this party store because they don't have a green light.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have to sell it, but we're going to direct everybody in our neighborhood to go to the party store down the street because they're a green light. There was total buy-in, so much so when I left office, we might have had 850 green lights across the city of Detroit. And so my critics would say, there's no evidence that green light really works. Well, what would make you say that? I mean, yeah, I can talk about this crime stat here, but there is no police department in America that can measure the crimes that were not committed because we don't know. There's no way to know. Now, we have stories of individuals who are probably coming to a location to do something. They look up, point to the signage. This location is monitored by the Detroit Police Department, and they see that blinking green light. I know you're curious about why was the light green. I'll tell you that in a minute. But they walk away. Now, I don't know what they were going to do. Maybe they were going to commit a robbery.
But it was a deterrent, you're saying?
It was a huge deterrent. And to this day, I believe it's still a big deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that really is leveraging that public-private partnership, working with small businesses with a neighborhood focus. So when you hear me talk a lot about as mayor, neighborhood focus, one of the other colleagues who's running for office wanted to criticize me and say, well, he talked nothing about public safety. Are you kidding me? Neighborhood focus is public safety. Look, downtown is a neighborhood. So when folks out there say, well, there's two Detroits, and downtown gets all the support, not the neighborhoods. Well, Detroit's a neighborhood too. And I understand those concerns, raised by the residents. And that's why, as chief, we police in an equitable way.
Mm-hmm.
And as mayor, we're going to provide the services in a very equitable way.
I hear this complaint when it comes to deployment of officers. Last summer, there was a mass shooting on the northeast side, and some of the residents there felt like the response was delayed, and they were frustrated that when they go downtown, they go to Greektown, they see, police officers all over the place, on every block, and they don't see that same level of deployment in their neighborhoods. Do you think that should be adjusted? Would you like to redirect some of that police resource downtown out into the neighborhoods?
Well, it depends. And I mean, I understand the complaint, and I'm going to give you another great example because I think this will resonate with your viewers. So there were two things that a gruffy 25-plus year veteran of the police department told me just before being sworn in. I said, what things can I do for you as your chief? And he said, fire everybody that's at the rank of, it was then inspector and above, and can we be cops again?
What does he mean by that?
Can we be cops again?
Yeah.
I was as curious as you. I said, you're a cop now. He said, we can't do police work. We're not encouraged. And it's a nuanced response. I understand it. I mean, the morale was down. They were being nitpicked through the federal oversight. So the police officers felt they couldn't do their jobs. And I agree. That's why I shifted the focus onto management and not on the cops, because management was one sitting back with their feet up and they weren't being sanctioned. Look, if you have a station that is habitually not adhering to the mandates, you're the problem, my friend.
Mhm.
And I'm going to get someone else to run this station. But again, going back to that whole thing of morale and how people are treated, those police officers knew I cared about them and supported them. And when I say that, it doesn't translate into looking the other way when there's police misconduct, because people know equally I was very assertive and public, very transparent on addressing those issues. It's good for the community to know, and it's good for the many good cops to know that the chief set a tone of, doing it the right way.
Yeah. Since we've been talking about green light, I think one of the more notable aspects of your tenure as chief was the expansion of police surveillance tools that has continued
Yes.
since you left. And I've heard, you gave a few examples. I've heard a lot of examples from police officers about how those tools have helped them solve cases and prevent situations from happening.
Right.
It's also gotten the city in trouble a couple of times with facial recognition software
I was
misidentifying
I
people.
was on the front end of that, and certainly this program would probably not allow me to talk as much as I need to about it, because one thing we did to offset some of the criticism is to really bring people into our real-time crime center
Mhm.
and educate them on what is facial recognition. It's no different than a mug book. That's the old antiquated way we used to do. We'd have a victim come in and we go through pages and pages, pictures, and were they misidentifications? Absolutely. Could we rely on that identification as a reason to solely seek charges with the prosecutor's office? No. Could we rely on a facial recognition to do it? No, not alone. It's a tool. And once I brought individual different groups in, most notable Rashida Tlaib, who was aggressively opposed. And so we brought her in. It was a very interested encounter,
Mhm.
as you may recall.
I remember
But
reading the coverage at the time. Yeah.
it went a long way. And certainly if the technology was abused or misused, uh, individuals who misuse it would be sanctioned.
Yeah.
Zero
Well, I ask
tolerance.
about it because there's been a few legal settlements that the city has had to pay out over people being falsely arrested as a
Right.
result of this
And
technology.
we put safeguards in place, and one of them is the tiered system of certainly accountability up to the rank of a supervisor, so that there wouldn't be mistakes or reduce. And we were very public about that. Uh, and certainly in anything, whether it's a forced situation, uh, sometimes there will be mistakes, intentional or unintentional. And depending on if they're intentional, then certainly it could result in being terminated or even criminally charged. But I want to get back to something before we get off, because I don't want your viewers to think that I didn't fully answer the question, because it's an important one. And this is about resource deployment.
Mhm.
Talking about what all the resources are downtown, but there was a big event that happened in my neighborhood, and the police took forever to get there.
Yeah.
Well, that shouldn't happen. Again, we put a great deal of focus on responding to crisis in a timely way. And so hearing a complaint, I'm not discounting it. Those are the kind of complaints I would want to know personally what happened,
Mhm.
so that we can, in a timely way, go back to the community member. But I take your viewers back to 2020. And remember, I talked about the issue involving the police officer who wanted to be cops again. Point in case, everybody knew about the Colony Arms on the east side of Detroit, uh, referred to in a joking way by Detroiters as the Carter. Now, if you've seen the movie New Jack City,
Mhm.
the Carter was that multi-apartment building, and every kind of crime imaginable went on in that location. But we had our own Carter, and then it was called the Colony Arms. You name it, it occurred. Prostitution, shootings, drug dealing. The good people who lived in that building felt a certain kind of way but there were no complaints coming into the police department about the level of criminal activity. Ironically, and Bing was still in office. Mayor Bing was still in office. I had to stress that point. And we launched on that location with 200 plus police officers in a neighborhood on the east side. Now, of course, we brought cameras. Because I wanted, the thing that was most important for me is to make sure that the community knew what we're doing, that yes, the police are back. Yes, we're not going to tolerate criminal behavior in any neighborhood. And so we executed and deployed 200 officers on this building. We must have made, if my memory serves me, maybe 40 arrests. And as the individuals we arrested were being taken out, the image that will stay with me for the rest of my life is people clapping. And plus, thank God, the police are back. So when I hear those kind of complaints, this is not just about downtown. Yes, downtown is important because when you look at locations where a large number of people gather, we have to ensure that they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me to another point, because I want to say this, especially before we end, and why I'm the most qualified to be the mayor. We're not just talking about executive leadership, but we're talking about someone who can manage a crisis. One of the number one responsibilities of a mayor, a governor, president of the United States is being able to keep folks safe. So that's a big responsibility. And so I don't take it lightly, never take it lightly. And so launching on that location to do what we did, but fast forwarding to 2020, when cities around our country were on fire, looting, you remember the images.
Mm-hmm.
In some instances, the police officers, a police chief, and the mayor stood by. In Seattle, she just reflected summer of love. Detroiters don't want that. In fact, Detroit was one of the few large cities that did not burn. And there's a reason for it. Now, it's a lot to it. Of course, leadership, our police officers, but our community, the activists that we talked about earlier in this conversation, who played a key role of being there with us, our clergy, who were very active. But here's why it's important. As your viewers consider who the next mayor of the city should be, take a look around the country at some of these cities. Let's talk about one for a moment. Let's talk about New Orleans. The recent terror attack where the individual on New Year's Eve, a key holiday, drove into the French Quarter and slaughtered people. And then the mayor and the police chief said, well, I didn't even know that the ballards were there or operational, whatever she said. And these ballots, what they're there for is to prevent vehicular traffic.
Yeah, physical barriers.
Physical barriers, but they call them ballots. I don't know what makes it different.
Yeah.
But that said, police chief didn't even know about them. The mayor had been warned that the French Quarter is a place where a lot of people congregate. And when we talking about New Year's Eve, what kind of safety plan was in place prior to that event? I know what we did in preparation for our annual Thanksgiving Day parade. I know what we did. I'll give you one more example because I think it's important because this is what I want your viewers to think about. Los Angeles, my home.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you lived in LA for a minute and a half, and some of your viewers know about LA and Santa Ana winds. In LA, if there's a high level of Santa Ana winds, there's a high probability there's going to be wildfires. I've seen the wildfires, but I have not seen what I saw this most recent, where the fires hit LA City. I mean, generally it's out in the hills, but this hit the city. And what was interesting about that, mayor takes a trip abroad, and I'm not criticizing the decision to take the trip, but I am critical that when she got off the plane and all this tragedy had happened, and a reporter said, and said, do you think, slashing the Los Angeles Fire Department's budget had an impact on the inability to control the wildfires? She looked, blank stare, looked down, and walked away. That's not an option. As a leader, someone who people rely on you for public safety, you do not get to just walk away. If you don't know, say you don't know, but say something.
Mhm.
And say, but I assure you, I'm going to find out what happened. And as soon as I know, you will know something. And so it's critical.
The next mayor is going to come in with limited resources compared to the current administration. You're not going to have access to ARPA money.
Right.
I've heard you talk about how your relationship with President Trump means you can bring federal resources to the city in a way that no one else can. Obviously, you are a Republican. This is a nonpartisan race, but you have a relationship with the current president. I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about that. When was the last time you guys have been in contact? What is your relationship like right now?
I spoke to him on not his last visit, the visit before. So yes, I have a cordial relationship with the current president. I'm absolutely convinced that as mayor, I'll be able to leverage that relationship. And this is not about me. This is about Detroit. Let's be candid. Mayor Duggan had full support of President Biden. It was very helpful to his administration and to our city. And I think that we need to keep that going. Now, some of the other candidates may say, oh, well, I'm going to have a relationship with the White House. But yet, in other times, you've said some horrible things about the president. And so this is, to me, when people ask me the question, I think having that relationship is critical. But let me remind your viewers, I'm a Detroiter first. Secondly, this is a nonpartisan race. Third, I was a Republican when I was your chief and deputy mayor. I was a Republican in Cincinnati. It's not a prerequisite that you be with one party or another when you're appointed as chief. I don't play politics. I play solutions. And in an insane way, I'll say this because this is so illogical. Imagine as a chief, and I say, well, we got a call, shots fired. And we ask the caller, are you Republican or Democrat? That's the decision of whether or not we're going to, it's ridiculous. And as mayor, there is no politics. There are issues. And what's interesting about the issues, I was a longtime conservative Democrat. I grew up a Democrat in this city. And one thing I learned from my late mom, who was a volunteer poll worker for many years as I was growing up, she instilled in myself and my siblings was vote. That's your right. Vote. But as important as voting, vote for the right person. Has nothing to do with party. And if you talk to Detroiters, they'll tell you, as chief, I liked you. I liked the work that you did. Nothing changes. The R behind my name, again, it's a nonpartisan race.
I want to ask you about immigration enforcement as well, because that's a big thing that we are seeing the Trump administration in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles. We haven't seen really any kind of directed ICE raids in Detroit, from my understanding. Mayor Duggan has been, he's reaffirmed that we are not a sanctuary city here, although the police department doesn't enforce immigration law. They'll cooperate with ICE if they're asked.
You just answered my question.
Well, yeah, my question really is if we see the Trump administration want to do more targeted enforcement in Detroit, would you partner with that? What would your relationship to that be?
Well, it depends on what targeted enforcement is. If you're talking about targeted enforcement to take illegal migrants who are criminals out of Detroit, absolutely. This is a conversation I have often. And one of the things I will assure your viewers is, as Mayor Duggan indicated, and certainly I supported this as the police chief, that we're not the immigration police, number one. Two, we are not a sanctuary city, but we are a welcoming city. I've had good relationships in Southwest Detroit. However, if someone's a criminal, zero tolerance. Not because they're here illegally in our country, because guess what? Should we make exceptions for someone here in our country illegally who's committing a crime, but yet someone who is a U.S. citizen committing a crime, we say zero tolerance, you can't do that. Where's the fairness in that? And bringing up Chicago, another mayor I should talk briefly about, he has an approval rating of about 13%. 13% may be the lowest in the country. Why? Because he's done more for illegal migrants than he has for his vulnerable communities in South and West Chicago. There's a reason why many of these Chicagoans, mostly African American, who said, we're going to turn Chicago red because this is unacceptable. But again, going back to the core issue, I would do nothing. I respect the laws of our state. We're a welcoming city. We are not a sanctuary city. But if you come into our country illegally and you're a criminal, you're going to be treated just like anyone else.
In some places, the ICE agents have been going into schools and churches and other places that have been, I guess, typically off limits for immigration enforcement. What do you think about that? Should that be allowed in Detroit?
Well, again, it's situational. I mean, no, as just a general going in without any type of reasonable suspicion that there is a person wanted for a crime, that's troubling. And, I've had conversations with the president, not on the immigration issue, but I've always been candid with him. He knows who I am. So, I mean, but if it was just a routine check, that kind of goes over. I mean, we certainly have a community here of law-abiding folks that are here in our country illegally. They need to be protected. But again, if the reasons are based and surrounding a person wanted on a crime, a serious crime, we got to do. Now, we should take the time to explain to our community what's going on. One thing I've known, this is not a big criticism, but one thing I've always found, municipal police departments tend to, because of our relationship with the community, and I know this was something that was important to me, is to make sure if we can't talk about it at the time of execution of whatever that operation might be, we owe it to our community to come back and say, this is why we did what we did. And that's what builds trust.
We're going to have you back on because there's a lot of other things I want to ask you about.
I know, it's a whole lot, isn't it?
This maybe will be my last question then.
Okay.
I'm curious, you talked about working with Dan Gilbert when you were in Ohio.
Well, I didn't work with him directly, but he was part of, Dan Gilbert built a casino in Cincinnati. My memory, it was around the same time that I met with those CEOs who wanted to redevelop a historic crime area.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, he was building a casino
mm-hmm.
At the same time. Like I said, I had no direct interaction with him.
Okay.
I am certain that he was aware of the work that we were doing in Cincinnati.
My main question really is what your relationship to the business community in Detroit is like. So far, we haven't really seen them get involved in this primary. They probably will at some point.
Absolutely.
What has been your message to business leaders? Are you working to gain their support and influence and donations?
Absolutely. I will tell you, my reputation and relationship with that community, in some instances, maybe not direct, but indirect. I had a very, how can I say this without naming the person, but very good to our community, one of the bigger corporations in our city. And the CEO said, what I like about you is what you did. He says, many things I like about you. I find you a leader and someone who's mature. But he also went on to say is that doing all that stuff in 2020, and because we didn't have the issues that so many other cities had, we could still encourage our partners to come in and do business. Because imagine, and let's face it, people thought, well, if all these other cities are on fire, Detroit's got to, because it's got a history. And literally, if you look back, even in our state, I was shocked when I saw that Grand Rapids had problems, Kalamazoo had problems, but not Detroit. So safe communities, safe cities affect your ability as mayor to entice new businesses to come in. You know, other candidates will talk about public safety, but what do you really know about public safety? See, I'm giving you real examples. I can tell you about, well, this is what I would do, but let me tell you what I've done. That's the difference. You want to talk about public schools. Well, if you're really interested in public schools, particularly if you have set in a position of leadership, what have you actually done and what's the outcome of it? Now, I'm limited as a police chief. I don't run the schools, but I saw something where what lane can I travel in? And even if it's a small difference, that's my commitment. That's my passion.
We are going to have to leave it there for now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank
Ladies
you.
and gentlemen, Chief Craig.
Appreciate it. Look forward to coming back.
Great.
Okay.
Detroit Next is a community-led project from BridgeDetroit and Detroit is Different, which means that we can't do this work without you. We need your support. If you have a question or a comment and want to participate in this process throughout the year, give us a call. We have a phone line set up at 313-284-6407. Leave us a message and we'll play it on the podcast. If you like what we're doing, head to bridgedetroit.com and subscribe to our newsletters. All of that content, again, is free, no paywalls for anybody. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible. Head to our YouTube channel to get full episodes and interviews along with extra content throughout the year. You can also find the audio version of this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and DetroitNext.podbean.com. We're going to be doing this all year long, so stay with us. Follow Bridge Detroit and Detroit is Different on your favorite social media platforms and take this ride with us. Thanks.